on, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
This figure is a redeco of a toy that has already been covered in detail on this channel earlier this year. As such, to save time, I won't be discussing elements such as articulation, transformation, sizing, and other intricacies. For a full rundown on what this mold does and how it functions, go check out Review 150, RID 2001 versus Cybertron Optimus Prime. We're mainly going to be covering the redeco aspects on this one, so if that's what you're into, welcome to Die! Redecos. They've always been a part of Transformers. They're always going to be a part of Transformers. Hell, if you really think about it, the vast majority of G1 was built on redecos, picking and choosing which Diaclone versions they wanted. It's interesting to see how redecos are handled throughout the years. Although they've existed since the dawn of the franchise, they didn't really go crazy until the Aaron Archer era, with painted ladders and vehicles. Then you got fun publications with their immense price tags, then they kick the bucket, then Hasbro takes up the mantle with Generation Selects. Then fans complain Selects aren't available in physical stores because nobody wants to stock brown paper boxes, and now we're here with store exclusives. As the franchise has gotten older, ire against redecos has proportionally increased. Why should Windsweeper be a redeco? Shouldn't he deserve his own molds? Shouldn't he not be packaged with this piece of shit? Why is Cannibal a retool with faux shoulder doors? Faux shoulders? Why wouldn't you give Medics a new mold? His Medics! Medics! Come on! Okay, for all my sarcasm, sometimes I do get it. Admittedly, I'm a little disappointed in the lack of new tooling on the upcoming Slipstream. Having things be a retool or redeco can be pretty disappointing. However, I don't think we're in a bad position right now. One thing I love doing when reviewing figures is looking back at the history of release strategies and pinpoint where things are right now. Often I've been called out for being too lenient on modern Transformers, lacking the edge I used to. But that's because I genuinely believe we're in a golden age of toys at the moment. Compared to what's come before, the quality is off the chain. So, to put it into perspective, it might be good to go back in time and re-examine a redeco practice that wasn't as inspired. Things weren't always the way they are now. They weren't bad necessarily, but you can definitely see where things have improved since. Greetings, Cybertronians. I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Cybertron Leader Class Galaxy Force Optimus Prime. Once again, not to be confused with Galaxy Force Leader Class Optimus Prime, because again, Cybertron's original name in Japan was Galaxy Force, and they renamed this redeco Galaxy Force Optimus Prime. Yeah, maybe not the best name to choose for a figure like this. Feels like the time they called Ratchet Rescue Robo just so their competitors couldn't use the trademark for the Machine Robo game. Oh, hello, painted ladder again. God, I love Aaron Archer. For the toys, not the copyright fuckery. So the question remains, what is Galaxy Force Prime exactly? Well, the thing about retailers is, they're impatient. They don't want the same toy line on store shelves in perpetuity, with a few exceptions. It's why Hasbro keeps renaming the toy line each year, and is basically forced to make a new trilogy every so often. Yeah, according to the Leak Squad, the design team didn't want to end Legacy and rename everything, but retailers wanted a new case assortment and all that shit. I can't verify this information specifically, as trawling through TFW is, well, very difficult, but apparently that's the reason. The same reason is why kid-centric toy lines add on a suffix whenever it enters a new year. Robots in Disguise Combiner Force, Cyberverse Power of the Spark. Hell, Cyberverse got it twice with Bumblebee Adventures. Though apparently the last one coincided with a show name change so they could count it as a separate production and pay the animation team less. Isn't the animation industry wonderful? Cybertron was one of the many lines to go through this metamorphosis, featuring the Primus Unleashed subline, coinciding with the end of the show and the arrival of the Chonky Boy. Thing is, far as I'm aware, none of these redecos actually ended up in the show itself. It makes sense when you think about it. Galaxy Force aired its final episode on December 31st, 2005 in Japan, and the Primus Unleashed line wouldn't make it onto store shelves until late 2006. Even if Hasbro had any say in how the show was produced over at Gonzo Animation, which I seriously doubt they did. The episodes were basically all done by the time these redecos went into production. As such, it's clear this range exists purely to have more product on store shelves. Yes, that's basically what every toy line on the planet exists to do, but this more so than most. And of course, being one of the most well-regarded Optimus Primes of the time, it was inevitable to push out another version just so retailers can go, oh look, a new Optimus Prime, Optimus Prime. Canonically, this is supposed to be a post-war Optimus, after Galvatron kicked the bucket and pieces finally been restored to the galaxy, and Kicker is there also. In practice, this is basically Cybertron Optimus Prime with all the blue parts swapped out for charcoal. There are subtleties on show, but this is it for the most part. Now, this might seem like a simple change, change, but it can have drastic consequences on the figure if done improperly. It's why color theory exists in the first place, and why everyone hates Victorion but loves Megatronia. Case in point, the original Cybertron Prime is a wonderful balance of red, blue, and silver. Red is the dominant color on show, but the blue peeks through and breaks it up sufficiently. Between the opaque and clear plastic, it gives it a real mean feeling, pushing through the toyetic nature of the design and drawing your eye to key details like the bull bar assembly and the piercing windows. It's a masterclass of deco design that elevates Kunihiro's work to new heights. But what happens when you swap out a striking color for a more muted one? The black they've chosen isn't exactly the son of a pitch. It's smoky and less of a salient feature. This can work reasonably well if it's a base tone, picked out with more dynamic highlights. At least I think it can. I'm not a color theorist, I'm just rattling off how I rationalize it. Point is though, that's not how it's done here. The purpose of the blue was to break up the red, but when you switch that out for a color that doesn't achieve that purpose, the red really overpowers the thing. It goes from a monolithic construct of purpose and mission to a sea of red plastic where all the details kind of blur together. The detail doesn't change from the original, it's still as good as it's always been. I mean, this is the mold that somehow managed to make the G1 trailer stripe into a gear assembly. That awesomeness is still mostly on show, but a lot of it just doesn't come across as well. All of this is amplified with a somewhat confusing choice of window swapping. The original had opaque blue assemblies and clear blue windows, so I guess the deco designer extrapolated that logic to make the windows on this smoky clear plastic. Think Coca-Cola Starscream from Hobby or New Age. Though much like the idea those figures are homaging, the interest ends up crumbling to dust. What was once an almost neon design statement that really emphasized the angular nature of the front now just looks bland. Like this is almost a prototype of the final design. And given the siren lights are on the same sprue, they end up looking like doubles of the transformation hinges, making this whole top section seem messy, not just in comparison, but as its own standalone thing. At least with the original they could be ignored. This ends up feeling like the hybrid style version, where it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's one of those deco choices that has no consideration for the original intent. They could have picked any other color, but they chose the blandest. But hey, at least they brought back the yellow lights that were absent from the Hasbro version of the original. Yay! Beyond that, there's oddities that don't bring down the experience per se, but they are somewhat weird. The wheel paint is swapped out for a dull silver, which I suppose is fine, but compared to the gorgeous shades of the original bronze, it doesn't make much sense. And the thing is, the bronze is present elsewhere on the figure. It makes itself known on the other side rocket pod that is also his other more bigger gun. I actually really like this change. It feels a bit more vibrant with the extra blue on show. Never realized this, by the way. The original Hasbro version only has painting on the outside of the cannons, while the Takara one has it on the inside too. Didn't realize until I was writing the script. Guess it's another cool feature to add to the pile. The Cyber Key is also categorically better than the Hasbro version, bringing back the gold trim from the Takara release, much like the yellow lights. Of course, I don't know where my copy's gotten to, so I'll just be using the regular one. But you get the idea. It's a nice touch, but it does make you wonder why they didn't put that budget back into the core figure itself. The return of the subtle bells and whistles feel nice, but it's sort of like the deco designer was missing the forest for the trees. Now, all of this is not to say the figure is bad by any means. I realize that due to the nature of this review, comparing what's better and what's worse, it's going to go over a lot of things that are categorically inferior. It's important to note, however, that the functionality is still as awesome as it ever was. He still carries a similar, albeit slightly diminished, powerful presence. Posing the cannons with those clickety ratchet joints is still an absolute joy. It's still pure bliss to roll this mechanical monolith across the table, even if the lack of pins on the Hasbro version make it a bit wobbly on the sides. In fact, getting him into flight mode, a good chunk of my issues aren't so egregious anymore. Revealing the hidden black in the middle does a lot to assist the breakup of the design, outlining the red wings and cab around a solid darker core. Will say though, the smaller guns sort of blend into the design now that they're cast in red, with bronze paint coating instead. I do love the bronze paint, but that base red doesn't quite achieve that extra bit of breakup, especially against the black. But I mean, come on, this has got to be one of the most swooshable Transformers ever put to plastic. Unicron Trilogy was on some other shit, man. It's still the same mold at its core, all of that charm carries over to the new version. I don't want you to think this is a bad vehicle mode, because it isn't. It's just that compared to the god tier brilliance of the original, yes, it is a step down. The changes made here clearly haven't had much consideration put into them. It's a redeco for the sake of making a redeco, and of all the choices they could have made, they didn't exactly pick the best one. There is one part where I think they improved on the original, however, the standalone cab. This still isn't a great mode to display in unless you have specific nostalgia for the Legends version, but there is one thing that's changed for the better. Because the thighs are now also cast in black, this mode looks a lot more cohesive. The waist section blends in far more seamlessly into everything else, else. And you have much more clearly defined color blocks of red and black. Said color blocks are of course less striking than the original, but a dub is a dub is a dub. We take those. Of course, I do find it funny that the Legends version took this idea and just threw it out, bringing back the oh so funny lack of cohesion. Maybe this choice was a budgetary constraint in retrospect, and the cohesion in vehicle mode is just a coinkydink. Speaking of, another thing I missed last time, the back wheels also aren't painted on the Hasbro version. Again, not something I noticed until writing this. In my defense though, I'm in a weird position of having the Takara version of one, but the Hasbro version of the other. I don't know, shit's weird, and I'm just trying to make it work. Anywho, since we've already covered the dimensions and conversion last time we tackled this mold, let's just move on. In the words of T-Fan page 101, in robot mode, yeah, maybe the added vehicle cohesion was a mistake. While the vehicle mode suffered greatly from the overabundance of red, Peacemaker Optimus's robot mode does the exact opposite. The red takes way too much of a back seat, while the arms and legs just... You know, I'm not going to finish that sentence for fear of sounding racist. So, what exactly is contributing to this overbearing dissonance? Well, taking a look at the original, you can see a lot of the design is broken up with other colors. You've got the grey underskeleton bleeding through the biceps and thighs, and even the fingers are a different color. When you swap that out for black, once again the aesthetic balance is thrown right off. Then you combine it with the shade itself. As mentioned earlier, they've chosen a specifically smoky shade rather than a pitch black. In vehicle mode, it couldn't really be seen well, but in robot configuration, you realize this thing really looks muted and dull. The black doesn't have the vibrancy it should, all because Hasbro didn't want to pay Anish Kapoor apparently. When you combine this lackluster shade with a shift in balance, you end up with a figure that almost seems embarrassed with its mechanical detail. It doesn't seem to want to flaunt it. Again, everything from the original is still here, but none of it comes across. And the thing is, they could have done better, and I know this because they actually did. The Legends version comes in the clutch with both a darker shade and extra highlights to pick out the thighs. This is what the leader should have been. It even manages to do the Cyber Key sigils better. These actually pop, while on the leader, they just blend into the red. For those wondering what these are, probably because they haven't seen the show, they're the 4 planet logos, done in gold and silver. The silver ones kinda stand out though, not as much as the Legends version, but the gold just fades into the background. I'm guessing it's because it gets lost next to the smoky windows, but it's hard to tell because, well, it's so hard to see. Conceptually, this deco choice should work on paper, but in practice, it just doesn't. Would have just taken an Autobot symbol over this shit. And in terms of deco choices that don't work on a conceptual level either, god, the unmasked loadout looks shit. Admittedly, I've never been a fan of the original version either, but at least with that you could tell the point with the chin and nose guards. At least they functioned, even if the Hasbro version got rid of the nose. But here, it's all gone. Nothing's picked out, so it just looks like several malformed scars on the inside of the helmet. He looks like the Joker without makeup in that one scene from The Dark Knight, where everyone's too afraid to look at him out of both disgust and misguided respect for what they thought was service in the line of duty. And I don't think that's the intent here. Sure, this is a post-service Prime, but it's clear this is just budget reallocation. Question is, reallocated to where? It's not like anything else has been given paint outside of maybe the headlights. Both tampograph systems use 2 layers, and everything else uses equal or even less paint. I realize that budgets can change from year to year, and the market is a fickle thing. It's why Hasbro deliberately did Swoop last in the SS86 Dinobots, in case they ran out of money and had to slash the budget on the last one. Swoop is the simplest, so logically it makes sense. But given it's just over a year between releases for this one, dealing with a redeco instead of a new mold, and way back in 2006 when budgets were much higher than they are now, I don't think I can give this one some slack. Ugh, enough looking at this fugly bastard. Let me just... There we go. Again, I don't want to make it seem like this is the worst thing ever. Categorically, it's the same mold again. The play features are just as fun as the original and is still the same chunkster he always was. There's a certain hand feel with this fella that just can't be understood without experiencing it in person, which seems to be a running theme for the designer. And to reiterate, that feel hasn't been lost from the original deco. To make it abundantly clear, it's still the same top tier mold. It's just... this deco does it no favors. Though, surprisingly, there's one thing that does. That is, does do it a favor. When you pop this guy into super mode, this actually works a lot better. It's still not on the same level as the original, but this genuinely brings the vibe a lot more. You can tell from the way this is laid out that this mode was the primary intent. And I mean, sure thing, this is the mode most associated with this mold. It's the most iconic, it holds the most important scenes, and all of the combinations are based around it. The arms that seemed really out of place now sit atop a backdrop of grey railguns and red wings. cannons, so they no longer look out of place. Similarly with the legs, the red cannons do a lot to break up the monotonous charcoal. I also much prefer the bronze they chose here. It's a nice little addition. Can't say the same for the lack of paint outside the cannons, though that's a Hasbro versus Takara thing, so I can't fault it too much. I also adore the red highlights at the front of the cannons too. It's something I'd have loved to have seen on the other versions, though that would clash with the other aesthetics, so maybe best to be left with wishful thinking. So basically, if this is the mode you're getting it for, or I guess this in the chicken truck lane mode, it's cromulent. It lacks the sheer presence of the original, mostly because it ignores all of the subtleties it was known for, but it's okay, I guess. Thing is, if you're getting this as a substitute because it's cheap, I'm not sure that's a good idea. For years, this was my Cybertron Optimus Prime. And yeah, for a time, I did love it. I cherished the idea of me actually owning a piece of 2000s Transformers history. However, in time, reality started to settle in. Something always seemed off about him. He was never a bad figure, but he didn't really live up to the original idea. It's only after I was gifted the original that I truly understood what I was missing, what they failed to carry over. It's with this experience that I can give one key piece of advice. Buy this deco because you want it specifically, not because you're settling. Don't buy it because it's cheap or because it's accessible or because it's generally easier. Buy it because you want it. If you don't really, save up the extra cash and go for the original. I realize that's big words coming from someone who was technically paid to take one, but chances are I would have saved up and gotten the original anyway, in whatever alternate timeline where I wasn't so fortunate. Point is, buy what you really want to buy, not what's easier to buy. You have your whole life to collect the figures you want. Don't settle for less. Though, how does this circle back to the ideology of redecos? Well, let's place this in the context of the redecos we get these days. I cannot stress enough that this figure is still decent in its own right. It might not seem like that in the context of this review, focusing primarily on the changes, but everything that was good with the construction of the original still applies here. With that said, it's also clear this is a redeco derived from corporate's desire to simply put more product on shelves. Much like the vast majority of Primus Unleashed, the choices are ultimately just there so Hasbro can tick a box. Instead of doing something unique and interesting, it's slapdash and poorly thought out. There are some neat ideas on show, but they all seem like they're in spite of corporate's efforts, not because of them. And yes, it is important to note that these redecos did make these figures more accessible to a new group of kids. Especially after the show ended and it was probably entering reruns, it was an easy way to access the characters seen in the show, albeit in slightly different decos. Doesn't mean it can't be done well though. Hasbro's redeco game back then could be really good. It's just that a lot of the time they took the easy route. Now compare that to the redecos we get these days. Well, at least focusing on mainline. Earthspark is another story, but let's ignore that. The desire to release product is still there. Hell, we're getting more products now than ever. Thing is, it's spearheaded by a design team that deeply cares about the pedigree of the franchise. Sure, they're derivative. It's been a long time since we got redecos that really went out there and did something new, with the exception of the parts forming buddies. But each redeco and retool they put out has intent behind it. Each release appeals to someone specifically, least compared to, oh, let's just swap out the sprues and call it a day. You know, I was actually talking about this video and my friend Rhymesworth a Dime actually pointed out something interesting. Technically, I've made this video before on a very similar topic. The old Last Night Reveal the Shield Optimus Prime is very much in the same vein, except on exclusives as opposed to just regular redecos. But it's the same thing until recently, both exclusives and redecos were just kinda pulled out of corporate's ass. Whereas nowadays, it's very different. Of course, not every redeco hits as hard as it should. As I said earlier, I'm still disappointed with the upcoming Slipstream, and hell, this can even backfire. For instance, I have a sneaking suspicion Galaxy Force Prime is gonna be the leader for the Walmart Cybertron capsule next year. We know a few of the smaller price points, but the leader still remains a mystery, and what better time to release Guop? For all his backlash, a good chunk of people still really want him, and why not spice things up with a new redeco instead of doing the old Siege version? Seems like an easy shoo-in for me, even if it probably won't turn out that great, as seen with my qualms with the original. But my point is still there. At least there's an intent behind the redeco. At least it's not just product for the sake of product. If this happens, at least someone will have sat down and asked, how can we make something that makes sense? Instead of, how can we sucker kids out of more hard-earned cash? Modern redecos are in a good place. Might not be ideal in some places, but let's face it, it could be a lot worse. But as always, fan and public consciousness is a conversation, so drop your thoughts on lazy or brilliant redecos below. Did you grow up with this figure? Did it ever disappoint you, or was it a childhood classic? What's your stance on the current state of redecos? Will I remember to make an "Our worlds are in danger" joke before the end of the video? Apparently not, so I guess that's twice now. Ah well, third time's the charm. Anywho, as always, remember, There's a context for everything. Till next time.